Good morning. I hope you had an interesting week looking backwards to discover the characters we thought about last week, those who charmed and inspired our youth as we encountered them in books. This week, we move on to real people, whose lives we have seen as examples worthy of emulation. There were those you were happy to follow from afar, and others whom you'd have walked across burning coals to merely shake their hand. Interesting, the categories our heroes fall into. The many who made great impressions on me range from our queen to academics, singers to politicians, saints to sinners. My life has been so enriched by so many fields. Real people are multifaceted. One may admire them for their courage in battle or in the House of Parliament, while being quite turned off by stories of wild sex parties or addictions, or the games they play to get elected. A closer examination often reveals how odd the things are that attract one to such strangers. Elvis Presley was the hero of my teens. He was noble and exciting, and I screamed myself hoarse when he appeared at Maple Leaf Gardens. Along with everyone else there that night, no one heard a note he sang because we were all on our feet and drowning him out. It was heaven, and the next day I cut off my long hair and had the barber give me a Presley cut. But as Elvis aged, stories of drugs and obesity and a broken marriage tarnished my hero. On the other hand, Vera Lynn only grew in my esteem, and in 1984, when she sang to the soldiers at Union Station as part of our Sesqui celebrations, I was totally her fan forever. To this day, hearing, "We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day," well, it brings a lump to my throat and a tear to my eye. She never did anything except inspire me with her talent and her service. And then there's another category, saints, who both appeal and repel. They fall into so many categories and are enshrined for bizarre as well as wonderful reasons. Think of St. Denis, the 3rd century Bishop of Paris, who picked up his head after he was beheaded and continued to preach with his head in his hand. Well, that challenges my belief system, and I expect to have no reason to attempt to emulate him. Another, whose footsteps I hope not to follow, is Margaret of Antioch, who, while imprisoned for refusing to marry a pagan Roman governor, Satan appeared to her as a dragon, and then he consumed her. Well, Margaret cut the dragon's stomach open from the inside with a cross she was wearing, and she escaped. But the lives of many saints provide great example of a life well lived. Mother Teresa of Calcutta has fascinated me ever since I read her letters, which disclosed her crisis of faith and her years of suffering with doubts about the very existence of God. Yet, despite her questioning of the reality of God, this Albanian nun carried on, dedicating her life to poor, sick, and dying in India, even as she sought to reclaim confidence in her own faith, the faith of her youth. She was still struggling to reclaim it at her death at 87. Her image as a selfless and tireless Christian ministering to the poor stood in marked contrast to what was going on in her heart. Teresa confessed that when speaking as if her very heart was a tender personal love with God, she was aware that if only her listeners knew her true feelings, what hypocrisy would have been their response. In her letters, as early as the 1950s, she recorded these examples of her inner torment. "Saving souls holds no attraction. Heaven means nothing. Pray for me, please, that I keep smiling at him in spite of everything." And then, "If there be no God, there can be no soul. If there's no soul, then Jesus, you also are not true." For her, even prayer was a betrayal. I utter words of community prayers and try my utmost to get out of every word the sweetness it has to give. But my prayer of union is not there any longer. I no longer pray. Yet she carried on in service and hope, What an inspiration for those who have doubts and seek explanations for their questions. Ever struggling on, sometimes triumphant, and more often failing. I find this saint a constant source of comfort and inspiration. Another great favorite of mine is the Archetypal Martyr for his opposition to my own denomination. Thomas More abandoned Henry VIII, whom he had so faithfully served, when forced to choose between Rome and Westminster, between the Pope and the King. My business card carries the quote that More wrote to his daughter on the eve of his execution. "I will pray for you, and you will pray for me, and we will meet merrily in heaven." I love the idea of his merry heaven. And his faith and mine is grounded in the evidence of our own eyes, as seen in another quote I savor. "If every gnat that flies were an archangel, all that could but tell me is that there is a God, and the poorest worm that creeps tells me that." Turning from saints to the political forum, and that's quite a turn, where again some inspire and some repel. 3 politicians inspire me because of their ability to respond fiercely to the needs of their time. Sir John A. Macdonald, who made Canada possible and saved us from annexation by the USA. Sir Winston Churchill, whose words and ability to inspire made all the difference in the darkest days of World War II. And finally, Margaret Thatcher, who demonstrated the guts and determination to take on her party and the powers that had bankrupted her nation. Each of them have, in recent years, been shunned and shamed by those who choose to judge their actions by 21st century standards and values, rather than acknowledge their motives within the realities of their times. Who among us would want to be reminded of every dumb decision or comment we've made? Even worse, to be judged as failing when attempting to do one's best within the limitations of our times. Another great favorite of mine is Lincoln Alexander, a man of endless firsts, whose life demonstrated that one can accomplish great things with grace and determination. Lincoln Alexander became the first Black lawyer to establish a biracial partnership in Canada. In 1968, he became the first Black Canadian Member of Parliament. He was the first Black federal cabinet minister, the first Black chair of the Workmen's Compensation Board in Ontario, and in 1985, he became the 24th Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. Lincoln Alexander used reason, charm, or ridicule, whatever would work to champion the cause of equality. But he was never mean-spirited. Those fighting for change would do well to emulate both his means and his success. His memory lives on in the Lincoln Alexander Law School at Ryerson, and on the 21st day of January each year, across Canada, we celebrate a great and inspirational life on Lincoln Alexander Day. Probably the living person I've most admired throughout my lifetime is our Queen. She is the embodiment of service and self-sacrifice and doing the right thing for the right reasons to the benefit of others, the peoples of the Commonwealth, and as an example to the world. When I look at the divisions of republics with presidents, I realize how privileged we are to have her as our head of state. To say nothing of the fact that I love the pageantry and continuity of all those years of history embodied in her role. And even villains can inspire one, to not follow in their footsteps, but to alert one to the dangers of the path one is upon, or to inspire one in opposition to all that which they represent. There are so many more who have captured my imagination for a time, and then have faded away, but have left behind a greater appreciation for the complexities that role models and all the varying virtues represent. Last week, we considered fictional heroes, and this week, the living, or at least those who have lived. The great thing about books is that the characters do not subsequently disappoint you. as their personal thoughts or actions become public. They are forever preserved in black and white and trustworthily static. But human beings lack that predictability, particularly today with the woke folk exposing every slip of tongue over one's lifetime. But when we seek what is the best in others and attempt to follow such footsteps or create our own variations, we are doing what our faith demands, using the gifts that God has given us to be the very best and do the very best that we can do. Those who impressed us and inspired us contribute to a better world. May we do the same. So may it be. Amen. Now, settle back into your easy chair and look back over the lifetime of impressions and fascinations you have felt for those who stand out in your memory. What did you try to do, and when did you succeed when inspired by others? Who helped to turn you into something wonderful that you had never dreamed of before? It is a great exercise in appreciating all the options that others unwittingly present to us, if we only have the courage to do and to dare. And if you are so inspired, do drop me a line to let me know your heroes. Have a great week.